This is what the air really looks like in Asia. Across Malaysia, Indonesia, and many parts of Asia, concentrations of air pollutants like PM 2.5, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and carbon monoxide have reached alarming levels. These are dangerous particles entering people's lungs every second and putting millions of lives at risk. This map shows how serious the problem is. And the truth is, it used to be worse. For years, the Science and Wellness Organization, SWO, has been monitoring air quality across Asia. The data from 15 to 21st of July 2020 shows that every single region in Peninsular Malaysia recorded pollutant levels that exceeded the safe standards set by the World Health Organization. On the 31st of July 2020, toxic air smothered nearly the entire peninsula. PM 2.5 readings reached Sungai Petani, 45 micrograms per cubic meter, unhealthy for sensitive groups. Georgetown, 43 micrograms per cubic meter, unhealthy for sensitive groups. Kota Baru, 35 micrograms per cubic meter, unhealthy for sensitive groups. Kuala Terengganu, 32 micrograms per cubic meter, moderate. Ipoh, 13 micrograms per cubic meter, good. Kuantan, 114 micrograms per cubic meter, very unhealthy. Temerloh, 74 micrograms per cubic meter, unhealthy. Kuala Lumpur, 73 micrograms per cubic meter, unhealthy. Bandar Melaka, 42 micrograms per cubic meter, unhealthy for sensitive groups. Kluang, 73 micrograms per cubic meter, unhealthy. Johor Bahru, 32 micrograms per cubic meter, moderate. This data reveals a terrifying truth: millions were forced to breathe toxic air every day. The Klang Valley, Malaysia's most populated region, has recorded some of the highest air pollution levels in Asia. Putrajaya, December 2020. PM 2.5 peaked at 134 micrograms per cubic meter, a level considered very unhealthy, while carbon monoxide levels rose to 3,820 parts per billion by volume. These concentrations are several times higher than WHO's recommended safe levels, meaning the air itself was toxic to vulnerable groups: children, the elderly, and those with respiratory diseases. Clang, September 2021. The crisis deepened. PM 2.5 spiked to 421 micrograms per cubic meter, a level categorized as hazardous. This is not just unhealthy. This is the kind of air quality that can trigger mass hospitalizations and cause serious long-term health damage. At the same time, carbon monoxide peaked at 5,150 parts per billion by volume. Such levels can reduce oxygen delivery in the body, leaving people at risk of headaches, fatigue, and even long-term heart problems. It is important to note, this toxic air was not isolated to Klang. It spread throughout the Klang Valley, blanketing Shah Alam, Subang Jaya, and Kuala Lumpur. Let's go back to July 2022. For one full week, air quality readings taken right at Top Glove Tower in Shah Alam were consistently poor, showing early signs of a serious problem. PM 2.5 levels spiked to a staggering 190 micrograms per cubic meter, classified as very unhealthy. Even more alarming, carbon monoxide levels surged past 5,000 parts per billion by volume multiple times in a single hour. Even more concerning, nitrogen dioxide peaked at 172 micrograms per cubic meter, and sulfur dioxide hit 210 micrograms per cubic meter, both levels unhealthy for sensitive groups like children, the elderly, and those with asthma. Fast forward to August 2023, at the same location, and the crisis showed no sign of easing. PM 2.5 levels skyrocketed to 229 micrograms per cubic meter, a very unhealthy category under global air quality standards. Carbon monoxide repeatedly exceeded 3,000 parts per billion by volume, reinforcing a dangerous and persistent trend. Nitrogen dioxide peaked at 82 micrograms per cubic meter, a moderate pollution level, while sulfur dioxide reached 37 micrograms per cubic meter, still within safe limits. These readings underscored that the air quality threat in Malaysia's administrative capital was not only continuing, it was intensifying. In August 2024, the trend of hazardous air persisted. PM 2.5 levels peaked at 163 micrograms per cubic meter, solidly in the very unhealthy zone. Carbon monoxide concentrations soared once again, this time hitting 3,510 parts per billion by volume at their highest, reinforcing a pattern of chronic air pollution. Nitrogen dioxide reached 84 micrograms per cubic meter, a moderate pollution level. Meanwhile, sulfur dioxide peaked at 27 micrograms per cubic meter, remaining within safe limits. Another year, another warning signal, and the problem remains unresolved. The data confirms a persistent and growing environmental and health threat in the area. This isn't just about employees, it affects the entire community, families, schools, hospitals, and businesses in the surrounding area. Clang, January 2025. 4 years later, little had changed. PM 2.5 readings again reached 403 micrograms per cubic meter, still in the hazardous zone. Carbon monoxide was recorded at 5,180 parts per billion by volume, almost identical to previous years. This shows a pattern of persistence. The same areas continue to suffer, the same communities continue to breathe toxic air, and the same health risks remain year after year. These readings prove one thing: toxic air is not contained, it spreads, it engulfs the entire Klang Valley. When the sun sets over the Klang Valley, many assume the air becomes cleaner and calmer. But the reality is far more dangerous. Nighttime is when toxic emissions peak. On the 25th of November 2020 at 11 p.m., the data showed alarming levels of carbon monoxide. Kuala Lumpur 3,310 parts per billion by volume, Shah Alam 5,170 parts per billion by volume, Klang 4,710 parts per billion by volume, Subang Jaya 4,900 parts per billion by volume, Putrajaya 3,250 parts per billion by volume. Other towns across the Klang Valley were also affected: Rawang, Bukit Jeram, Balakong, Semenya, and Banting. These are not small spikes. They are toxic surges reaching thousands of parts per billion, levels that the WHO classifies as extremely unsafe for human health. Fast forward to 28th of April 2021, again at 11 p.m. Instead of improving, the problem persisted. Shah Alam recorded 5,220 parts per billion by volume, Klang reached 5,290 parts per billion by volume, and Subang Jaya hit 5,340 parts per billion by volume. Night after night, families were breathing poison in their sleep. By 4th of December 2022, the same deadly trend continued. Shah Alam again exceeded 5,000 parts per billion by volume. Subang Jaya climbed above 5,400 parts per billion by volume, while Banting recorded 4,270 parts per billion by volume. The toxic cloud was not shrinking, it was expanding. On 13th of February 2023, the nightmare repeated itself. At 11 p.m., Shah Alam recorded 5,180 parts per billion by volume, Klang 4,980 parts per billion by volume, and Subang Jaya 5,360 parts per billion by volume. Even Putrajaya and Banting showed dangerous levels, proving that the crisis had become entrenched, not occasional. On the 10th of December 2024, the data revealed something even more disturbing. The pollution was no longer confined to the Klang Valley. That night, Port Dickson, a coastal town outside the valley, recorded 3,130 parts per billion by volume of carbon monoxide. The toxic air is spreading far beyond its source. And then, 24th of January 2025. Nearly 5 years after the first records, the story remained the same. Shah Alam, 5,170 parts per billion by volume. Klang, 4,950 parts per billion by volume. Subang Jaya, 5,310 parts per billion by volume. Putrajaya, 3,030 parts per billion by volume. Even Rawang, Bukit Jeram, Balakong, and Banting continued to record dangerously high levels. The pattern is undeniable. Every year at the same hour of the night, toxic gases fill the Klang Valley sky. This is clear evidence. Toxic emissions are released at night when public attention is lowest. The problem is not limited to the Klang Valley. Johor, Malaysia's southern industrial hub, tells the same disturbing story. When the sun sets and families settle into their homes, the air outside becomes poisoned with invisible gases. On 31st of October 2020 at 8 p.m., the data revealed dangerous levels of carbon monoxide. Skudai, 4,150 parts per billion by volume. Peninsular, 3,790 parts per billion by volume. Kulai, 2,980 parts per billion by volume. Johor Bahru, 2,820 parts per billion by volume. Other towns, including Pontian, Ulu Tiram, and Pasir Gudang, were also affected. This was the first clear signal that Johor's night air was toxic. But instead of improving, the crisis worsened. By 24th of September 2021, Kulai recorded 5,250 parts per billion by volume, one of the highest readings ever seen in southern Malaysia. Skudai and Peninsular were also above 4,000 parts per billion by volume. On the 9th of June 2022, the situation remained critical. Kulai reached 5,210 parts per billion by volume, Peninsular 4,410 parts per billion by volume, and Skudai 4,480 parts per billion by volume. Year after year, the emissions continued at night, poisoning thousands of residents without warning. By the 2nd November 2023, Johor's industrial belt was drowning in toxic air. Peninsular peaked at 5,040 parts per billion by volume, Pontian surged to 4,690 parts per billion by volume, and Johor Bahru itself recorded 3,010 parts per billion by volume. The trend continued in 2024, with Kulai still at 3,700 parts per billion by volume, Skudai at 3,570 parts per billion by volume, and Johor Bahru at 2,540 parts per billion by volume. Despite small fluctuations, the numbers prove one thing: the problem is persistent and systemic. And most recently, on the 3rd of January 2025, the toxic night air still choked Johor. Kulai recorded 2,140 parts per billion by volume, Skudai 3,140 parts per billion by volume, and Peninsular 3,530 parts per billion by volume. Even though some towns showed slightly lower figures, the crisis remained. Johor residents were still breathing poison every single night. Georgetown's air shows a decade-long crisis. Carbon monoxide concentrations at 11 p.m. 2020, 2,700 parts per billion by volume. 2021, 2,430 parts per billion by volume. 2022, 2,370 parts per billion by volume. 2023, 2,990 parts per billion by volume. 2024, 2,310 parts per billion by volume. 2025, 900 parts per billion by volume. PM 2.5 has remained unhealthy for years. 2020, 107 micrograms per cubic meter. Very unhealthy. 2021, 86 micrograms per cubic meter. Unhealthy. 2022, 50 micrograms per cubic meter. Unhealthy. 2023, 108 micrograms per cubic meter. Very unhealthy. 2024, 39 micrograms per cubic meter. Unhealthy for sensitive groups. 2025, 42 micrograms per cubic meter. Unhealthy for sensitive groups. Even in 2025, the air is not safe. Kuching's PM 2.5 levels show the same dangerous cycle. 2020, 51 micrograms per cubic meter. Unhealthy. 2021, 45 micrograms per cubic meter. Unhealthy. 2022, 26 micrograms per cubic meter. Moderate. 2023, 56 micrograms per cubic meter. Unhealthy. 2024, 18 micrograms per cubic meter. Good. 2025, 63 micrograms per cubic meter. Unhealthy. Even after temporary improvements, pollution keeps coming back stronger. The truth is undeniable. Malaysia is far above safe limits. According to the World Health Organization, the safe annual limit for PM 2.5 is 5 micrograms per cubic meter. In Malaysia, the annual average is 15 micrograms per cubic meter, 3 times higher. The WHO's 24-hour limit for PM 2.5 is 15 microgram per cubic meters, yet Malaysia records an average of 35 micrograms per cubic meter, more than double the guideline. For nitrogen dioxide, the WHO annual limit is just 10 micrograms per cubic meter. Malaysia's annual average is a shocking 280 micrograms per cubic meter, 28 times above the safe level. The daily limit for nitrogen dioxide is 25 micrograms per cubic meter, but Malaysia records 70 micrograms per cubic meter, nearly 3 times higher. For sulfur dioxide, the WHO's 24-hour safe limit is 40 micrograms per cubic meter. Malaysia records 80 micrograms per cubic meter, double the guideline. And for carbon monoxide, the WHO's 8-hour average limit is 10 milligrams per cubic meter. Malaysia records 10,000 milligrams per cubic meter, a level that is dangerously above the safe standard. These figures leave no doubt Malaysia's air is far from safe. Every major pollutant exceeds WHO guidelines, putting millions at risk. All this data across years and regions points to one fact: Malaysia's toxic air crisis is real, and it is getting worse. It is not just a local issue. This is a regional crisis with global consequences. The time to act is now. Join the Clean Air campaign. Together, we can save millions of lives.